Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Jyothsna Rao, manager of Indian Care. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the lands of the Kulin Nation people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So at Indian Care, we work with migrants of Indian community living in Victoria. We were set up in 2014 to address their welfare needs. In 2020, because of COVID, we expanded our operations to include countries of South Asia, which is Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bangladesh. Um, and there are a few people or groups of communities that we work with. One of them is international students. We provide emergency relief as well to family violence victim survivors. We work with elders and we provide emergency food relief that is culturally appropriate in the form of either grocery boxes or food vouchers. We also warmly refer people needing support to support services. And it's our greatest delight to introduce two eminent scholars, Dr. Sabitra Kaphle. Sabi, would you like to talk about yourself and your work? And
Oh,
next is Dr. Nilmini Fernando. Off you
thank you,
go.
Dr. Jyothsna Rao, for inviting me to join Chai Chat today. I'm really excited. So, yeah, my name is Sabitra Kaphle. I born and grew up in Nepal, and I migrated to Australia about 15 years ago. So, I am an academic and a researcher, but also works in health sector for a number of years in Australia as well as in Nepal, and I have also worked in a number of other countries in South Asia as well. So yeah, mother of two children, married, currently working full time, and I'm just excited to go with the flow. What comes in next conversations, and I will take any questions as well if you have.
Wonderful. And Nilmini Fernando.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to chat with such concerned and active and women from the South Asian subcontinent or and area that actually do a lot of deep work in the space across all the different spaces. So I'm actually so happy to be here. I was born in Sri Lanka. I'm Sinhalese ethnicity, and we moved to Australia after quite a bit of a hopping around. I call myself a serial migrant. Arrived in Australia as a child, then went traveling overseas, lived over in England and Ireland. So I've kind of had the experience of being a woman of colour in many different contexts, and that's what spurned my interest in the topic of intersectionality. I'm a mother. My son is absolutely gorgeous, one son. And I think that's, yeah, so a lot of my work, I work as an academic and as a consultant, working with organizations to really more deeply understand racism and sexism, all the isms, really, and to change the way that we do things so that not so many people are excluded and left out and pushed to the bottom. So that's kind of my area. I'm a bit political. I'm also a bit creative. I write, I do performance. So I'm just so happy to be here tonight.
That's wonderful. And so our topic today is intersectionality among South Asians. And the reason we find this very interesting is because I'll speak from my angle of India. So, India has many castes. It's based on a caste system. While we are trying to get rid of it or trying to make amends with it, it is still there. It is just there. We also have different income levels. We also identify with different religions. And so, naturally, marrying outside of your religion or outside of your caste or outside of your social status strata, all this impacts on the person. I find it very interesting because I arrived in Australia 26 years ago, and I think as a mother of two children, as a person of color, as a scientist by background, as well as working within the social sector, there are many nuances that actually influence and shape the person I am. and my experiences are very unique. I bring very different perspectives to a lot of things on the table. So I guess today we would like to talk with both of you about, do you think we can bridge the policy, I mean, the gap between policy around all this, because we are a multicultural country. So the gap between policy and practice. And so that's what we would like to hear from you, Nilmini, on the policy aspect, and Sabi from a practice angle. So where would you like to begin from?
I'm happy to start because, as I say, I born and grew up in Nepal in the village, and like Dr. Jyothsna mentioned that I would like to take back myself for a while in my childhood when I grew up, as a female child, because we had gender discrimination, son preference, daughter preference. The way my brother will get opportunities to raise was different to the way I got opportunity to raise in the same family. So nothing wrong about my parents, but that's the construct of the society that we live in has already created different layers for how a girl should be raised or how a boy should be raised, and that's just one example of gender. And then I remember that at the same time we had different caste system, and I was from the higher caste families, but I see the villagers coming to the house from lower caste, how they had to actually respect and that casteism and put themselves in the bottom of the ladder, and they were basically voiceless. And then we go on to the economic status, like we had poor, rich, and poor people, and we were kind of trained, because I worked in community development before, that 2080 um, formula that we would call is like, yeah, 80% people who are poor get only 20% of resources, and then 20% people who are rich has access to 80% of resources and opportunities. So I think, and we have rich cultures, rich social system that makes it unique, but at the same time we have so many different layers within the communities, and that discriminates from one to another. And the one becomes the victim more compared to the other. So I think that's what made me very passionate from when I was a child, that, well, there is something wrong in our societies and we need to change it. And I think personally myself, got that motivations of, there is this is a social inequalities. We all should be equal. We all should have equal opportunities and access to resources, because it's part of who we are. Because why other persons in the same class that I go to the school, my friend doesn't get same benefits that I do, living and growing up in the same village and same school. So that kind of wandering came, and then I came to Australia. So my background is mostly in health sector. But then I came to Australia, that Dr. Jyothsna mentioned, because with the same questions, like, okay, so why society is different, why we treat people differently, and why don't everyone have equal rights and opportunities in the societies? It's not only being a male or female, but why we categorize people with so many other different layers. And then I came here as a migrant, and the more layer came into play. Like, yes, I was black, and by the way, even I was from Nepal. The first comment I will get is, "Are you from India, Sabi?" Yeah, fair enough, not too far, I would say. Then that comes, and then the other layers comes is, oh, okay, from developing countries or third world countries, people easily say. So we are not
Totally.
even one world, so we are third world countries. And then, yes, female, it's still the huge gaps be in terms of gender. That's the another one. Then then I became pregnant, became mothers, then came, oh, parents with the children, like, you can you really do the job? But being highly qualified with the doctorate, and have double and triple degrees, and into Australia's and there, And you feel that in every walk in life here, even when you walk down the street, you sense that, you've been um, categorized. So
Yeah.
yeah, people would say, "Oh, your English is so good, Sabi." Like, what are you talking about? So I think that's where we still have a long way to go, and that's where it's still, even in we live in Australia or United States, because I do lots of research. So I do look at the evidence around South Asians migrant, whether they predominantly would live in Canada, US, UK, Australia, for the opportunities in New Zealand. And it's more or less it's the same, that intersectionality, in terms of the categorizations of people with the different layers. We all experience different barriers, and that's actually annoys me every day. Like, well, my friend, if I don't want to name anyone, but if they're white, Anglo, they're born with English, because I usually challenge people that, what do you mean? Are you only calling the native people is who born with English language?
This is
And
so,
yeah.
this is totally resonating because I had a similar question many years ago when they would say, "Oh, but you speak English." And I often remind people that India was a colony of the British until 1947. So such a unique experience and history you have, Sabi. And I'm just wondering, Nilmini, if you have found anything similar, because we have identified language here. We've identified that Sabi is highly qualified, is a mum with children, and working full time. So we've already seen some of those layers coming up. And the fact that she's a female child born in a South Asian family, and then, of course, the color of our skins.
Yes,
So, how do you
yes.
think?
Yeah, so that is so important, because what is important, I mean, I'm kind of coming a bit from the theory, but the theory of intersectionality is so vital to be able to understand these experiences. And for me, intersectionality, like my interest in it, my childhood, I was born a girl in a family of boys, and I had all the equal things, and same food and education, but I sensed my worth was less because I was a girl. Second of all, a lot of comments from my own Sri Lankan community would be saying, "Oh, you've got such dark skin." So that's called colorism. It's a form of racism that actually means darker means bad, lighter means good. So when the way that to understand these, like I understood, I lived my life, went to university and everything, and never thought about this in terms of the structures. And then I realized that it was not just me being put into these positions. There were a lot of people like me. And that's when I discovered the Black feminist theory, where intersectionality comes from. And it helped me to understand that it wasn't my fault, that there wasn't something wrong with me. We are organized in our various societies according to norms and hierarchies. The key word is hierarchy. Some people are worth more, some people are valued more, some people's work is worth more or supposed to be, so therefore they're paid more. So that's with men and women, the gender hierarchy. So then there's the racial hierarchy. Now, when we're living in a white country like Australia, it's multicultural, yes, but the dominant structures favor, at the very top of this hierarchy, all the rules, policies, laws, the courts. It was designed to benefit the colonizers, right? So they were the white, middle class, wealthy, elite males. They're at the very top. So anybody else is considered different. So when we say our differences and why they matter, we must always be remembering that it's the differences from that norm, right? So anytime you step out of what's considered important, valuable, worthy, then we either get punished for speaking out or being, I was often punished for asking the wrong question, opening my mouth, being told it's very good to be smart, but you mustn't talk about what you know about. That's the conundrum that women of color, people like us, have to face. Yes, your intelligence is important, but when you start using it to ask questions, then you get told to be quiet. So silencing, as Fabi said. So it's like the hierarchies are really important. Um, so as a theory, we need to understand that it's not just one difference. And intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and a Black feminist context, who's a legal scholar, to show how women of color were both and gender and race, not separate. So women of color in America were subject to racism and gender together. So the laws that dealt with racial discrimination, you couldn't claim them both. With gender discrimination, you couldn't claim them both. So Black women were treated, they didn't have a place where they could take their concerns and claim their rights as everybody else did. So that's how it came about. But to be honest, it's Indian women. I mean, feminist movement has been in India since the tree hugging movement. There've been a lot of land rights, indigenous movements. Women from our cultures and our South, the global South, we've been active in this kind of equality struggle for a long time. So intersectionality describes it in a current theory. So that's the way to understand. That's how I understand it. And I think, like any good theory, you can apply it. So what I find intersectionality is crucial, because what happens is the same people always get pushed to the same bottom of the same ladder. That is what we need to address. So it's systematically pushing people to the bottom, always the same people: women of color, so racism, gender, sexism, and class, socioeconomic. And in Australia, it's very important, as we did in the beginning, to give a acknowledgement of country. It is Indigenous peoples who know the most about what happened here. So when we try to fight these systems, it's so important to put their experiences front and center, so that we can understand how those structures were set up, and then that'll give us clues about how we can tackle them. So the whole point of understanding where we stand is so that we can make a better world, a world that is good for our boy children and our girl children and our gender diverse and maybe LGBTIQ children. And that's why I'm motivated, because I want to make the world a better place for them. And that we deep down, I think all of us believe in equality. It's very hard to get when we don't understand the systems that constantly reproduce inequality for some. So I'm going to leave it there. Yeah.
That is
Can I
so
just
true.
comment? Can I just comment on?
Please.
Here on what Dr. Nilmini was talking about from context perspective in South Asia, because I was pondering at the same time, because the power, the status, and it's really important things in South Asian culture across the board. Like, and when we talk about a classism, that's the different things. But it's not only about class as well. The power works in different layer in South Asian culture. The patriarchy comes, and matriarchy comes as well. Mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, and if I give myself as an example, because I don't mind putting myself on the spot there. For example, like if I am a daughter-in-law, married, then I will have a husband to some extent in the patriarchy to rule me, and then I will have mother-in-law in the same structures to what's right to be done and what's not, and then I will have other in-laws and father-in-laws as well. So it's a typical example there, because it's not uncommon to other society as well. But what I'm trying to say is that makes more complex, especially if you are a woman. Regardless, you may be working full time, economically capable, but those social expectations doesn't go away. You still have to serve in the same way you do if you are a full time mother at home, or if you work full time at home. You still have that. We live in that double and triple burden of societies, and that's being really talked, because mostly what society said that, oh, she's a bad mother, or we talk about that. So I think that's one important thing. And the other important things I just wanted to clarify here is about the gender diverse people in South Asian context, because we do have lots of stigma around that, and that further marginalizes people. If they're gender diverse, then there is no environment to coming out and disclosing our own identities, because and that's where the people struggle a lot. And the another layer comes, like, okay, mental health, the depressions, the problems, when the person already is struggling with what's my identity is, because I can't tell my parents because I may be judged, or mistreated, or even socially isolated. and that actually triggers that, the health and social well-being. And put that in the context of, if they're from vulnerable or poor families, then what would be the outcome for them? So it's just, we can only envision that. We don't really need to go there, but there is a lot of cases like that.
That's true. And I think the current pandemic has actually brought that out quite significantly in Australia. So there's a this conversation is a wonderful segue into this question is from Chris on what is the role of religion in making people understand the concept of intersectionality. And I think we'll take the second one too, which is how do we get our conservative parents to understand the concept of intersectionality? Brilliant question. So I
Excellent.
yeah, I invite both of you to give your comments on this.
Look, I'm just going to say something briefly about currently there's so many nuances, but it's really helpful to think which of those matter the most to whom, right? So then, because intersection analysis, you can go everywhere, but I'm always encouraging people get overwhelmed. How all these differences, how do I deal with it? It's about when you're working with a particular organization or a person or yourself, which matters at that moment, right? That's one thing I'd like to say. And also, when you talked about power, identity and power, these are the things we need to pay attention to. And often we get to that attention through the harm, who's left out, who's at the bottom, who's hurt, who's not protected. And that's how we get to see those structures, right? So religion, like for me, I think a good way to understand and get to the bottom of it, I guess, is two things. One of them is the idea of master categories that divide all our societies in common, but in different ways, depending on gender, male, female gender. And that also means, because it's a binary, that anyone who falls outside is breaking the rules. They're going to get punished, penalized, not welcomed, and excluded. So there's gender, then there's class, like, different class. And then you've got caste in the South Asian continent, but then you've got gender, class, and race, right? They are the three master categories. And then within that, you can see the differences between our groups, like we're called South Asian, but we're not one lump of a group, right? We are
No.
so many differences between us. And that is what gets lost. So when we have identities given to us that we didn't choose ourselves, like, I can say a migrant, but I would not choose that. If I was a white person traveling, I'd be saying I'm a traveler or a holiday maker. But suddenly, because you're a person of color, you're a migrant, So those labels are loaded with race meaning, gender meaning, all that kind of stuff. So with the religious, I would put that any kind of discrimination according to faith is a form of racism. So Islamophobia, anti-Semitism are actually forms of different manifestations of racism and then, difference in that way. So at the moment in Australia, the biggest discrimination, the most on the rise, is religious discrimination and faith-based discrimination. So we really have to address that. And in my country, like I'm a Sinhalese, but there is sort of a lot of attacks on the ethnic groups, the Tamil, but also there is that religious component because the Buddhist, is in bed with the state power. So when religious power and state power come together, you can have, sort of group oppressions like that. So I just wanted to say about the different faiths. And obviously since 9/11, it was the Islamophobia. That is a really big one. From that moment on, Muslim women, anyone who wore a veil, that's a visible marker of their difference, right? So
Yes.
I have and they are the ones who get attacked. Have you noticed that when it's their veils are taken off, spat on, they don't attack the men, right? So it's actually quite cowardly, in my view. Do you know what I mean? So the gendered racism, that's another aspect of how we can understand intersectionality. Racism is often played out on women in one way and men on another way. And I think domestic violence is one of the ways that we're kept in our place. And in the patriarchal system, which puts, white men at the top, but we have to understand that the whole major thing that's organizing us is colonization. So for colonization to happen, we had two patriarchies to deal with as women of color. Our own patriarchies of color, and the white patriarchies. And the men themselves had to deal with the white patriarchy. So just to say about the gender diversity that you brought up, that before pre-colonial, we had a lot of different genders. even in our
Yes,
culture, which we don't even know about. Indigenous people have, Native American people, two spirit.
yes,
There was a spectrum of genders. Colonization just said, right, you can have this or that, you know, in order to have that power. So it's a form of power, of enforcing power. So that's
yes.
kind of, yeah, some ideas and some thoughts I had around that.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's
I hope that.
interesting you mentioned that bit about the diverse genders pre-colonialism, because even if you look at Hindu mythology, the god Krishna that we all follow, I mean, in one of his avatars, he comes as Mohini. That is nothing but a transition from a male to a female. So, even if you look around, like Indian stories and all, that is very, very common and it's very accepted. I mean, India does have trans people, and they're just there. I mean, yes, they are now spat upon and they are, ridiculed. But before all this happened, when the binary structures came into place, they were part of the community and part of the
Exactly.
society. So
Mm.
I think, yeah, it's very interesting. So I'm just going to go to our next question, Sabi, on how do we get our conservative parents to understand the concept of intersectionality? Because in South Asia, patriarchy is very entrenched, and that's why it's interesting that there was a recent article in Sari Collective, which is an online, media, where this has been brought up that women understand violence from our communities, understand violence as physical and not coercive control, whereas because that's very insidious. And I think that comes from this: how do we
Mm.
educate and raise awareness
Hmm.
around intersectionality,
Yeah,
Sabi?
I think the religion actually, these two questions were they're really great questions and they kind of sets the scene because I wouldn't call conservative parents um, because that's the social norms they grow up with. That's the generations. So they had probably no choice or no awareness or educations with how to step out of it. But what I think is, I did recently publish a book which mainly focused on socio-cultural context of South Asia. That's where I talk a lot about the culture, religions, gender, and power. So, but I would like to say something about religion first, and then then the parents, because well, from intersectionality point of view, from human rights perspective, people shouldn't be discriminated against any layer, right? There is no, they can't. It's against the human rights. So the religion is one of the marker, and then also highly discriminated against the religion. Like if you wear hijab, that's the simple things. The dress of you do, because I had a student was scared to come to the university in her traditional kurta solvar. And I said, why? Because you need to keep showing your identity, like, oh no, people stare at us. And I could actually feel that, because yes, people stare at us, and it creates fear, and we don't feel safe. And that's where the mental health, the sense of safety and security goes away. So the religion, because well, all religions are important in some ways because it creates some sort of social norms, but also all religion has, either way, or I'm not categorizing any, because I have done the study of all different religion, has in some ways it created that construct and the rule to dominate women, and also to dominate, in some religion dominates by caste and things. But in every religion there is some way or another, it could be some characteristics, like when you have your period, or you married, or you born
Yeah.
as a girl, or things, there are gender discriminations embedded into it. And then let's go on the parents, because what parents brought up is learning that what our religion says, what our faith says, what does that look like, being who we are, or who our children are. And that's how they wanted us to be a good citizen, right? From their point of view, every parent wants their children to be a good citizens, and their influence was religion or faith or social systems passed on from there, and they try to teach us the same norms with the hope that we will become a good citizens.
That
So
is
it's
true.
okay, it's nothing around that. So now how we can change that mindset is, it's not actually going to the parents. Yes, we need to start educations there, but this generation is late. What we need to do is educating from the
The
start,
child.
from early childhood, from the children. So when
Yes.
Yes.
we start raising our younger generations from the children, it needs to start from home, even from, just after they're born. What toy do you buy?
Yes.
Yes.
What, if yeah, I know you could have, money to afford, you could buy, the whole room sets of toys and clothes for your first baby. But think about, there are children who hasn't even have a food to eat. They're dying with starving. I think that kind of social justice educations
Yes.
needs to
Equity,
start
around
very early
equity.
in the society.
Yes, I agree completely. And I think also this whole thing about blue clothes for boys and pink clothes for girls, and then, I think those things also need to go. So, and I often say to my own children that, look, I can't do much with what has happened, but what I can do is raise the two of you to understand that it's okay, and it's, very interesting and a very, very critical point, Sabi. Thank you. So I,
Absolutely.
yeah, so I hear somebody saying hi to you, Indira
Oh yes,
Tiwari, Sabi.
that's my friend.
How nice. Yeah, so I think we can keep talking about religion, and there are a few more that is coming through, and one of them is about, now let's go to language, Sabi. You mentioned about being asked
Yeah.
about your English speaking ability by the whites. What is your opinion about internal division and racism within the South Asian themselves? I think this is such a good question because I think in our communities, we discriminate, like both of you also said, between the male and the female child. And then when we grow up, it becomes the son and the son in law, the daughter and the daughter in law, and the mother in law, the mum, and then the father in law and the mother. So I think it is, again, there are so many frames that you can analyze it on. So,
Yeah, so I'll comment, Chris. Good questions, because I ponder myself being, being a woman from Nepal, grow up in the village. Because as I already mentioned, the power, the position, the legitimacy is a big thing. It's everywhere basically, because we think it's big thing in South Asia, but after working here and internationally in few years in UN, because this, the status quo that people get, either it's from the it could be from the, if we talk about South Asia, it could be from the caste system, like, oh, we high caste people, we have legitimate power, or we work in administrative senior roles, so we have legitimacy or the power that we could easily play and dominate, the lower caste populations, or the obvious, the gender. So this, if you're asking me personally, it annoys me. I feel disappointed, because why in the earth we need to live in the societies even today just to be victimized for the we we have done nothing wrong. And there are so many group of populations probably think the same ways. Like, I can feel the anger in your questions, because I have anger all the time, that I, yeah, I'm highly qualified. I live in Australia. I work in, decent places, but it's still that I experience this institutional systemic discriminations, just
yes,
because
and
my name sounds different, just because
yes,
my full name is written differently,
yes,
and just because, I can't speak the same accent that, the Australian born will, I have good English, but I just can't speak the same accent. And my response to them is like, if I am talking to Melbourneian, I would say like, did you go to Tasmania and did you have a communications with the, the real Tasmanian people? Their accent is different.
yeah, up north it is different. They are more, they
Yes.
drawl their English. So I think See, again, there are again so many layers coming into this. So, what do you think, Nilmini? Do you see
Well,
this playing out in an Australian
oh
setting?
gosh, yes. What I'm thinking about the accents is everybody has a culture, everybody has an accent, right? But some accents matter, and some accents are used as a way to push people down. So to me, that's always
Mm,
goes back to racism and class, right?
Mm.
Why? What is it that makes some things less valuable than others, right? So it's
yes,
a way to keep society going with the same status quo for the people who have, always had it. Put it that way.
yeah,
So that's why I'm always going back. Like I think the personal and the what we see in our clients and people we research with, and we're obviously on social justice. We're trying to find a way for them to get their rights. Right.
yeah,
That's what our all aim is: to be treated with dignity, to have the human rights should be equally afforded to all. But because of all these differences, they're not. And so we see the same people, and for all different kinds of reasons, like caste and class and all those differences. But in a way, like you said, all the societies have them. But in this society, we as South Asian migrants, diaspora, we have to navigate the Western culture and our own culture. That's an extra complication. So that's what
yes,
I would call living at the intersection. The same way we live at the intersection of male and female, male and female with this side.
Mm.
So I think living in those intersectional spaces, we have very deep and important insights as
yes,
researchers, as practitioners. That is what in sociological theory they would call it the insider, the outsider within, right? So we have good knowledge. The poor people have a good knowledge of power, much more than, and they
the
can see it
power
better.
themselves. That's true. That's
Absolutely.
true.
They can see the
Yeah.
power. So I'm talking here about why we need to assert the work that we are doing with our communities and our communities as having knowledge. That is very important for this society to heal, and to become
Mm,
equal. So in a way, the reason is, why should we do this? Why should we do intersectionality? Because of all the injustice, the pain, the suffering, but also that we need to be able to understand that there is somebody invested. A whole lot of people are invested in keeping things that way. So
yes,
intersectionality gives you a way to name it, give it a name, so that we can identify it, then we can speak about it, and then we can do advocacy or strategy around that. And it's always
yes,
about superior, inferior. It's about pushing somebody. And I'm just thinking about recently, like, for example, like recently, Indian citizens who are Australian. But you're not just part Australian, you are Australian with the full range of citizenship rights, right? You think. Then suddenly they say, okay, anybody from India can't come in. So you're not treated as an equal citizen, right? To the people, in the meantime, people from South Africa, white people from X, Y, and Z can come in, but not Indians. So what I'm saying is these kind of rights, they're very tricky because they can be taken away at any time. What we
yes,
want is for them not to be taken away, inalienable, So that conditional rights is something that I think I've tried to educate my son. I try and educate my colleagues who are sometimes in white organizations to really understand that, because then we can stop doing things that perpetuate those systems.
yes,
Yeah, I think just one point, because going back to Chris' questions was about within the South Asian diaspora
Oh,
in
yes.
here, the power struggle, or the differences. I think he was trying to ask. So now, being in the communities, I can feel that, because
Yeah.
if I got your questions right, is that the fight is same. Yes,
yes,
because within the South Asian communities, there are
Mm,
people who take advantage, who take
yes.
power, who hold positions here as well, in the name of so many different things. So it's there are not everyone with a good faith and good social justice principles. So when we feel that, yes, why? Because I know it comes in the media now and then, the people take positions and power and authorities and exploit fellow South Asian communities
Yeah.
who are
Yeah.
yes,
newly
yes,
arrived. So it is really frustrating that shouldn't happen, but it is happening and it's
Yeah.
there. So what we need to do is, from a advocate point of perspective,
Yeah.
is we all need to talk about it. We need to fight against it, and the fight is same. no matter whether they are from our own communities or from other communities, because that shouldn't happen. And we
Yes,
must talk about
yes.
it, we must raise it, and we must, talk it louder.
Yes,
And
and it
to
can get,
understand,
yes.
sorry, Sabi, and to understand what's happening, to be
Mm.
able to read the situation differently so that we can see that and name it, then we can start to understand it. And then we know where to point our energy. What are the things that we can do that are going to have the biggest impact? Sorry, Jayat.
No, that's 100% right, Nilmini, because we had, so there you go. Chris has popped up with this one where what should the women of color be fighting for? Equality or justice? I just want to reword that a bit. I think it's more equity or justice, not equality, because we get we get equal opportunities, but is that equitable? And when we say equity, that's when intersectionality comes in.
Yeah.
You know equal is like A is equal to C or A is equal to B, but that's not what it is, because B is B and A is A, and that is inequity. So what are your thoughts around that? And this is, I think, a perfect question for you, Nilmini.
Well, I'm going to give you my radical and quite critical answer. I'm sorry, I can't help it. This is my area.
Go for it.
When we have equality, feminism started off as one thing, right? And then it morphed into the thing that privileges elite white women more than all the others. So all the other things got dropped off. Even right from suffrage, when they abolition, suffrage. If you look at all the women's movement, but before that we had decolonial movements, anti-colonial movements, that women were gun running, even in Ireland, right? We were part of that, getting rid of the oppressor. And so what happened was certain forms that actually give financial benefit, liberal feminism, took off because it serves the exploitation of labor. So when you say equality, my brain goes meh, meh, because it's about what they were seeking is equality with elite white men, whereas intersectionality in our work seeks equity. That's the equality of outcome, right, for all of us. So that is where I depart from liberal feminisms. So I hope that answers your question, Chris.
Yes, I think it does, and it's really well covered. Now, I would like to put this question because I'm mindful of the time. Do you think the gap between policy and practice can be bridged? I think that's a $1 million question, but I still think we need to have a discussion around this.
So yeah, I will start because I think that's kind of my research area too, trying to advocate the government all the time that, yeah, the policy comes first or practice comes first, but it should come side by side parallelly. So bridge the gap. Well, if we talk about, indigenous health gap, 30 years difference we live in is still now in life expectancies in this country. So it's a long way behind. But if we don't start now, then it will never happen. We don't have hope, we don't have optimism. So we can bridge the gap, but how we can bridge the gap in policies and practices, it shouldn't be a separate things. That's where I start with. Because, policymakers, they sit on the table, they write policies. And then the people in the communities, they sit down there, they live their experiences. And what happens at the moment is the experience of people who is underground doesn't reflect in the policies which is written in the the closed doors. So I think that's the starting point. So the people, the politicians, um, need to go out, spend time with communities, listen their stories, be part of their story, be part of their life, understand the context first, because you can't write a policies for South Asian communities without talking and understanding the life of South Asian communities. You
And
can't. You
without
can't
having
do
a
that.
South Asian at the policy table, I think
Thank you.
that is the most.
Exactly.
Yes. And then,
Yeah.
this whole concept of diversity, but my point is diversity should not be a tick box. It
No,
should
it's a
also be
tokenistic at the moment, Dr. Jyothsna,
totally,
because
totally.
that's the thing.
Completely.
Like, because we take in system label, in policy system label, we take tokenistic approach. Yes, we have representative from South Asian communities, Mr. X or Mrs. Y. We're done. Tick the box. But do the people actually represent the voice, that stories of lived experience of people who are struggling under the ground? Because
Yeah.
that's
Totally.
where I'm investing my energies and time. I'm tired of advocating it, but I'm not tired because we must still advocate because we're nowhere near. But there
Yes.
is a future if we all work together. That's what I said to every people. Like, we just have to keep raising our voice and keep showing our black color. Yeah, we're women, we're black. What's wrong about that?
Yes.
And that tokenism, having just one.
Yes.
My strategy, if somebody invites me, I always make two, right? Then I bring a person who's got, everyone has got lived experience, but a person who can represent. When I do work in organizations, we are doing it at the organization I work with at the moment, that they get paid good money for giving their voice. Where there's one, you make two or three spaces. Because when you've just got one, it's so easy to just ignore. And also, what kind of knowledge? Like when I did research on family violence, when they're collecting knowledge and data about all the differences, there's 3% this, 4% that, but what they're not doing is understanding what is the thing that affects all of us together. What is the common structure that we need to put across? And then we come always back to patriarchy, right? It's to support patriarchy, and then racism is about which patriarchy. So when you get those voices at the table, women's voices, our voices, are rarely at the top table. They could be there doing all the labor. We're doing all the labor of producing these really authentic, genuine, and ethical research to inform the policy. Then it gets watered down, whitened, and it gets to the top. So our work doesn't, and because as women we're disvalued as women academics. Plus, it's really hard to get work in the academy if you're a woman of color to have influence.
Yes.
So yeah, it's about what knowledge gets counted.
Yes.
Um,
And I think the diversity topic is very interesting because it's not only diversity, say, from a person of color or anything, it's also diversity of perspectives and diversity of ideologies. If
yes,
you have the same ideology where the burden is put on the individual, then that is liberal, that's neoliberalism.
yes, it
Whereas
is.
if you look at systemic issues, then that is again a different ideology. But there was a very interesting article very recently that journalists also come from privilege. And I thought that spoke volumes about the way media is handling all this. So you see, there is no diversity at the top level anyway. And I can speak from an ethno specific organization point of view that we struggle to be heard. Yes, we are asked for, what do you think of this and what is this
Mm,
and what is that. It's almost as if a data mining happens with all
mm,
our cultural perspectives. But
mm.
when the policy is like exactly what you said, Nilmini, that by the time it actually comes out, it doesn't quite look like what we have talked about. And oh well, I think we have a long
Yeah, I
way.
think that's where it get frustrated. Don't you still think, like, when you call your doctor, like, oh, do you need an interpreter? I get sick with that questions by now, and I can understand how many people would get sick with that. Like, do you not have any other thing to understand me as a patient? You just worry
Yes.
about,
Yeah,
do I need an interpreter?
yeah.
Thank you very much. I don't need an interpreter, but because I work in health sectors and the family violence and gender, is that because that construct, the social construct we're talking about, is most important. And when you were talking about Dr. Nilmani about, oh yes, academia, or you need to be a successful professional positions in new countries like Australia or state or Canada's, because I remember that the backstage singers, and the feminism movement, and those are in the music industries actually, because all black women were the great singer always backstage. And I actually had that conversations recently with somebody in a really high positions, that I will always be a backstage singer because I do work to make somebody else the front stage.
Mm. Yeah,
And
I think
the person who is in the front stage does very little. So that's what
see
happens when we talk
it
about,
is what happens.
color
And it's
and
everything in our society is working in that favor. So when we talk about privilege, that's what we're talking about.
yeah.
The whole thing is already set up. Go to the right school, you got all the right friends, and then they run the companies, and then they get you in. So it's like a stream that takes you to the top. And that's what we need, a structural approach to break that privilege that comes with and people don't want to give up power. So it's really hard. But that backstage thing, I think that the diversity thing gets people. Can I say I hate?
Mhm.
Diversity really annoys me, and it's frustrating it's neoliberal language. It's a way of not doing the work, right? We'll do a weaker version. So what everything about diversity has shown, you get different people in the door, but they stay there. They don't get to the top. That's diversity. Whereas intersectionality can help us to strategize and actually show what's keeping people down all the time. They don't progress. So there is a difference in the method, and we should put it to use, is my feeling, once we understand how it works. And diversity is just like a weak kind of version. And to be honest, the most beneficiaries, when they had gender diversity, most of the beneficiaries were white women in all the countries, our colonial settler countries like Canada, Australia, UK, New Zealand. The beneficiaries of gender diversity were white women. And then when it became diversity for different genders and sexualities, it was white men and white LGBTI people. So to me, that it wasn't people of color. So even in the academy, they're very few. They had one person on the whole thing. We need 50% plus, because our community, our multicultural society, is over 50% diverse, right? So we need the same representation at every point.
Mhm.
How we get there is another question that we need to understand what we're going for, isn't it, as well, Sabi? And that
Yeah.
frustration.
Yeah, but we can't get frustrated, Nilmini, because we've got to advocate, advocate, advocate. And also, I think your voices are very important because you
Yeah,
are working in this, where you're looking at these frameworks,
yeah,
you're analyzing these frameworks. And I think giving that opportunity for you to talk and your academic groups to actually talk, I think that's really powerful, because even from a science hat point of view, I see that I often tell my students, I said, just have a look at that random clinical trial on what was that cohort developed on. And women, yes, we are women, but we are not the same. We are very heterogeneous in the way we are. And personalized nutrition is now taking the spotlight, because people metabolize the food differently, and we don't eat nutrients, we eat food. So this whole intersectionality concept is just so interesting to me, because we can extend it across so many areas. It's not just limited to one type of ism, but can be,
exactly. Mm.
it's just so pervasive in what we experience. And yeah, I think, yeah, anyway.
I mean, I
So
think
we'll,
when it comes down to talking to the question that Chris asked about between, like even within my family, I have a person, which I don't want to name, is actually against asylum seeking. And I'm saying to my brother, I'm saying, listen, you are Sri Lankan just because you came on a plane. We get indoctrinated as well. So there is
yes.
some work to be done. And I think we must be very kind to our parents, beautifully kind to our parents because of what they've been through. But our children, my whole thing was I'm breaking this cycle. That the work we're doing can be breaking patterns and breaking cycles so that we don't perpetuate them. And I think that's the hope in it. And the young people that are doing this work are incredible.
Yes.
So we need to be there to say we love your work, we're there to support you, answer your questions.
Yes.
And yes, when you said frustration, I will never give up because I'm committed, because deep down we know what's right. And I think a lot of white people also know that. And a lot of men know that. They know because it harms them too. These systems harm
Yes.
a lot of people. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and
So
I think I'll just comment on mindful of time as well about from policy perspective, because Dr. Nilmani, you talk about diversity, because government takes diversity as another tokenistic thing,
Yeah.
And the language the government and the system uses culturally and linguistically diverse communities.
Yeah.
That's the language in Australia, used by the government. And I always argue that, well, everyone is linguistically and culturally diverse. So why do you categorize certain people who come as a migrant or refugees or asylum seeker in that, umbrella and branch? And then why not others? So what's the logic behind? Absolutely there is no logic behind, rather than did you born in Australia or do you born with English? That I always question back. So we talked about, that's the structural discriminations and operations that government already puts in their language, and that
Yes.
annoys me all the time. Then I argue that, like, well, the government, whoever leads, is like, don't you have a language and don't you have a culture? Then why do you need to, create that another layer of operations? When we talk about intersectionality, is that it's embedded within the system, and that's where the policy
That's
is
right.
false, and that's where the practice is safe. Like, you go to health services or education sector, and then you do the form saying, do you identify with called, like, that they use the short term like called. How
You
disrespectful it
know, it's a code for race, really. It's a code for racism, you know? And you're
is.
right, it's very lazy. And we need to just keep pushing and pushing. And that's the hope for me. There's a lot of
Yes.
hope here, I want
I
to
think
say.
we, yes. So I think we'll end it on that note that there is a lot of hope. And I will agree with both of you that called is a form of othering.
Yeah,
And it's, these are difficult conversations. And I'm really happy that we have been given this opportunity to have it here today, where it's out in the open, where people can see. And I really wish that this sparks more conversations. It I have great faith in the youth. And I think they'll shape up pretty well, because you know what? You and I and Sabi, we brought up our children. And on that note, thank you everyone for tuning in. Until the next episode. Bye
thank
for
you very
now.
much.
Thank you
Thank
for
you so
having
much,
me.
Sabi and Claire.